that's fixed. Thank you for catching that. Um, so today we're going to be reviewing for exam 2. Again, this is for SDE. So this is not for 2110. I've already had some confusion with 2110 students thinking that this lecture relates to that class. It does not. Always kind of down there, you'll see the course that I'm teaching. I assume my sound is fine now. My camera's a bit cockeyed. Not sure what's going on with it. Sorry, T-Tours. Um, anyway, the wire is kind of messed up in the back. There we go. Okay, so today's going to be exam 2 review. I'm going to spend most of the first part of it just discussing how the exam is going to be run. I only got one question on Piazza to answer. Uh, so if you have other questions, please just reply to that Piazza thread, which I'm going to link in chat now. Again, generally, I don't answer questions that take the form of will blank be on the exam. If it is something we have covered since the week before exam 1, because if you remember, we kind of pushed back exam 1 and did exam 2 material before exam 1, it will be on the exam. Nothing from exam 1 will explicitly be on this exam. So, for instance, I won't necessarily be asking you about inheritance structures directly, but that said, understanding inheritance structures is critical to be able to effectively draw UML diagrams or talk about abstraction, etc. So there is some learning that you're expected to have carried over. So the first thing is that the exam will be asynchronous. I will not have everyone take it at the same time. Rather, it will be open from 9 a.m. and these times I want to be very clear are um, Eastern Daylight Time. So calculate if you're not in Eastern Daylight Time, calculate the time frame from there. I gave a very wide window to take this exam. This is to ensure that it is a reasonable hour for you, no matter where in the world you are right now, even if it may be later in the evening or early in the morning. It's still an hour where you would typically expect to be awake, unless you sleep 13 hours a day, at which point, kind of envious, not going to lie, but that's not super realistic. Anyway, so the exam will be available from 9 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. However, you will not have 13 hours for the exam. There will be a time limit. That time limit likely to be 60 minutes. I haven't finished writing the exam yet, so it's possible that could expand, but I would expect 60 minutes. That means from the time you open it, you have 60 minutes or until 11:59 p.m. Eastern. So if, hypothetically, for example, let's say you started at 11:30 Eastern, you would only have 29 minutes. So it is at max an hour, but if you start late, you will have to finish early. So don't wait till the last minute to open it up. It will close at 11:59 p.m. All your answers will be auto-submitted, and that'll be the end of it. Um, can you discuss? Okay, yeah, sure. So I'm seeing those questions again. Keep the questions coming in that Piazza thread, and I will answer them as they come to them. This exam will be open note, open internet, and open slides. And the simple reason for this is if I tried to prevent this, it would not help. It would only help student. It would only hurt students who are honest. So I don't want to do that. Um, so open note, open internet, open slides. You can also open up your IDE and write code there. That's fine as well. It is not open classmate. So if I discover that there's any communication, things like that, and I will be comparing the exam to see if people are copying. I've actually already seen cases on the quiz where I'm a bit concerned people have been copying off one another. I want to stipulate ahead of time. If I find reason to believe that you copy off a classmate on the exam, it will be an immediate F in the course or a no credit if you're going with the credit no credit option. So it is not open classmate. It needs to be your individual work. But that said, that individual work can be aided by your notes, by the internet, by my slides, by my in-class examples, whatever. You will need a camera of some kind, but this is not. I'm not going to watch you take the exam. That's not what I'm doing. Rather, there's going to be a part of the assignment where you need to draw a UML diagram, or part of the exam. That is certainly going to be there at some point. To that end, you could try to do it in PowerPoint and take a screenshot, but I actually think it would just be, or Violet, and do it that way. I personally think it would be faster just to draw it. Um, so we are going to uh, recommend strongly that you draw it on with pencil on paper or with pen on paper, whichever. Take a picture of it and upload that picture. That is the intent, assuming I can do that. I'm still trying to work out if I will be able to do that within Colab, but I think I will be able to. Any questions about the exam procedure or how it's going to be done? And I'll give plenty of time for this. So again, open Note, open Internet, open Slides, open compiler, open IDE, whatever you want. Just it's still individual work. That's a requirement. All right, failing to see any questions. I should note that I've only received 2 questions so far. And if I get through them and there are no other questions, I will end the lecture. So if you do have the questions you think you will ask about any of the material, now's your chance to ask it. Again, I don't answer questions in the form of will blank be on the exam, but certainly I'd be willing to clarify any concepts that are on that topic list. Is the picture meant to be submitted at the same time? Yeah. So to be clear, I believe Colab actually lets you upload images into the form fields. Um, but keep in mind that when the time, even if it doesn't, you will strictly be required to submit your content by the end of 60 minutes. So if 60 minutes has passed, anything completed after that will not count towards your grade, which is to say, if you don't submit your picture until after that 60-minute period, you will get 0 points for it. Not partial credit, not a late penalty. You will get 0. And again, this is assuming the exam is 60 minutes. If it's 75, obviously that 75-minute mark. But the point is, once you start the exam, I will get a timestamp saying this is when you started the exam. Anything completed after that 60-minute period will not be counted, and it will actually lock you out of the Colab form at that point. I believe Colab lets you upload pictures from the exam frame, but if it does not, then I'll set up some means to do so, probably through email. What if your Wi-Fi cuts out? Don't let your Wi-Fi cut out. I realize that's not a great solution, but it's the only solution I have because there's no way for me to verify what happens. So do everything you can to make sure you are on a stable Wi-Fi, because there won't be any leniency on that. And I realize that that's difficult, but this is the difficulty of doing an online course, is I have to assume everyone is taking the exam under the same conditions. So if your Wi-Fi cuts out, it's going to be difficult. Yes. Um, but just be aware that's a limitation I have. It's not one that I like doing, but when I have to give the exam in a somehow fair situation remotely, that's the rule I have to put into place. So the second you open the exam, the timer starts. If you leave the exam, the timer will still be running. Any other questions about the how the exam will be given? And trust me, I don't enjoy saying that, but I have seen students abuse this type of thing before when I've taught an online class, where, for example, they said their Wi-Fi was cut out. But yeah, uh, I know another class. Yes, so there have been difficulties. So one thing I'm playing with is actually doing a Google form rather than Colab. I'm still working on these ideas. Part of it is I'm still writing the exam first, but I recognize those issues will be there. All I can say is if there are widespread issues with the class, that will certainly factor into the grading. Would you suggest we sign in the test on mobile and upload a picture or email the pic to ourselves? I would personally recommend just emailing the pic to yourself and adding it on the PC. And again, I will test the exam beforehand, but that would be my suggestion. Again, I realize that these limitations are not ideal, and so I'm not happy with them. Which is to say that I I'm more willing to be stricter here, given that the class is currently effectively pass fail for most students. Um, so that mean we really don't have 60 minutes. I'm not sure what you're asking. You have 60 minutes. So from the time that you start the exam, that not that you log into Colab, but that you hit start on the exam, it will pull up the exam webpage and you'll have 60 minutes. I mean, sending yourself an email is part of that. I don't know. Yeah, it should not take you too long to send yourself an email of a picture. Um, so for students with SDAC accommodations, there will be a separate exam which has a different time limit um, that you will be given a password for. Uh, but that said, it will auto submit at the time limit. So, like, say for example, you had time and a half, you would have 90 minutes. Yes, and it would auto submit at 90. But again, you needed to have already contacted SDAC and set that up. And for the note, yes, I do feel it's reasonable to have you be able to take a picture and send it to yourself in a short amount of time. I think that's a reasonable expectation. Let's not actually though. Let's be polite to each other. You could just make sure to please be polite. Thank you. Any other questions about the procedure? Now, I do have to add this stipulation, and this is a limitation I have to add ahead of time. If there are typos that emerge on the exam, I cannot fix them. What I will either do, two things, I will either accept any reasonable interpretation or I will throw the question out. And by throw it out, I mean give everyone full credit. If you have questions about the UML symbols, you can go ahead and just write that in the Piazza thread, and I will be happy to answer those questions. Um, or type out a formal question. I'll be able to do that. So to that end, sorry, I admittedly blanked out there. I was on. Sorry, I got distracted here. What was I talking about? Sorry about this. My mind is admittedly kind of racing with this. Oh yeah. So if there are typos on the exam in that, the reason I can't correct them is this: if someone starts the exam at someone starts the exam at 9 a.m. and they take the exam and they see the typo and they interpret the question one way and then they answer it. If then at 3 p.m. someone says, "Oh, I think this is a typo. Is this a typo?" If I tell them it is, now everyone who's taken from 9 to 3 is at a disadvantage. And the reason for that is they saw a typo and were not instructed how to fix it or how to interpret it. So, to be fair, and this is again one of those things that this is a limitation of a remote class that I would never do in person, but I have to do online. I'm not willing to answer any questions during the exam about the exam. That includes how to interpret directions. That includes whether or not something is a typo. If you feel something is a typo, you are welcome to email me and I will take that into account. Or if the question, which most of the questions will be open ended, if the question has an open ended space, Is it possible to turn up your mic volume? Yes, it is. There we go. Is that that's probably a bit too loud. All right. Let me know if that's better, but I'm worried that's a bit too loud because I am redlining a little bit. If I'm deafening people, I apologize. So because of this limitation, if you feel there's a typo, okay, so some people are going to say too loud. Some people are going to. If I'm too loud, it's easier to turn it down than it is for me to be at max volume and too quiet. I'll leave the volume here for now. So to that end, I won't answer questions about the exam during the exam, but any space where there is, if you believe something is ambiguous or a typo, you can lay that out, and I will try to take that into account while grading. Keep in mind that just because you think something is a typo doesn't necessarily mean it is, and so try to interpret the questions as they are written as best as possible. So again, I won't be able to answer questions about the exam during the exam, and neither will the TAs, and that's just again because the distributed nature of this exam. Any questions? All right. So since I'm not seeing any questions, and I'm just gonna move into looking at some of the lecture notes again, just to help myself answer these questions. So the first question I see on Piazza is, what is the difference between functional independence and abstraction? And I should note ahead of time that there is some overlap in these terms. For example, highly modular functions are more likely to be independent. Highly independent functions are more likely to be modular. Generally, when we're talking about functional independence, we are talking about the function level. So we're talking about coupling, how much functions couple. An example of two functions that have a tight coupling could be something like, and I'm just going to write a class here, temp. Let's say that I have some kind of private int state code, something like that. A private int state, and I'll just call it that. And the idea here is this would be just hypothetically, let's say that this is some type of like eBay-like system. So one could be a state saying listed. Two could be a state meaning valid bid. That is to say that there is a valid bid on the item. Three, sold. Four, ignored. Oops, did not mean to do that. Ignored. That is to say that we have some private code. And it could then be, and let's say this is static for now. It could be that you necessarily have to have some kind of link between functions. Sorry, let's make this not static. Let's call this class bid. And again, I'm being very informal with the Java code here. So I may have two functions, public void list and public void process bid. And these two functions can change this state. Now, at this point, because these two functions both rely on this field, they are actually coupled. Because these two functions won't directly call each other, but they will rely on some shared variable. Now, some degree of coupling is unavoidable. Certainly, if you have functions that modify a given state variable, that's going to if two functions that rely on the same variable, they're going to have some type of interdependence. But what you want to avoid is you want to avoid having significant functional interdependence whereby list needs to know details about how process bid works, or process bid needs to know details about how list works beyond what it would be considered the interface. Um, and this isn't always completely 100% attainable. As we show here, these two functions will modify this field. They do have, therefore, some type of shared dependence. So this is not something that we're looking for a black or white world where there's functional dependence and functional independence and we have a clear line between the two. Rather, we want to limit these dependencies when feasible. So limit how many functions rely on shared variables. Abstraction is a similar concept, but with abstraction, what we are discussing is to focus on the interface, not how something is implemented. And a pretty standard example of this, if you take a look at the, excuse me, I actually have my homework 3 code up here. Um, if you take a look at the homework 3 code I uploaded, you will notice that anywhere that I can, I use map, not hash map, or I use list, not array list. Program to the interface. So the interface isn't just the method signature. It is also the why, or the what the method does. Like why the method exists, what the method does at a high level. So for example, in an array list, the add function adds at the end of the list, or just in any list. The add function adds a value at the end of the list. Now, in an array list, it adds into the first empty slot of the array, or if the array is out of space, it expands the array and then adds at the first empty slot. With a linked list, we create a new node and we adjust the tail pointer. Tail.next equals new node equals, or tail equals new node. But the fact that I know those things should not affect how the list is being used. So when we're calling an interface, we want the interface, that is, what public functions are available, to be enough to perform the actions we want, but requiring the minimum amount of information or understanding to use them. For example, if I'm thinking of the abstract concept of a list, it's just an ordered set of elements. And so I can work with a list without caring whether or not it's an array list or linked list. Now, when we're talking about efficiency, certainly we care whether it's an array list or a linked list. But we should design our software such that we can make a change to the underlying implementation where if the interface is preserved, that is to say that the public interface is preserved, someone using our interface will not have to change their software because the implementation changed. So for example, if I change how this list function works, or in state, if I change how state reader works, let's say I pull in, say, an XML file instead of an XLSX file. Because I use the abstract state reader, and the state reader factory handles which file reader I get, from an outside perspective, I don't need to worry about which state reader I'm using. I only need to know how to call the get states function. And that's all I need to worry about. So when we're talking about the interface, yes, we're talking about the public method signatures, but we're also talking about not just the signatures, but what the method is intended to do, correct? With functional independence, we're talking about how we design our functions to coordinate together. With abstraction, we're talking about, from an outside perspective, how much do I need to know about how the class works? And the ideal situation is that I don't need to know anything about how it works. I just need to know what it does, what the interface does. Another good example of this is cars use good abstraction. The Tesla uses good abstraction because it has a gas pedal and a brake pedal and a steering wheel, all things that a petroleum car has. The gas pedal doesn't actually do anything with gasoline, but I know how the interface of a gas pedal works, and for me, it doesn't really matter how the car works under the hood, provided that the interface does what I expect it to do. All right. So functional independence, we want to minimize dependencies between modules. Modules is a broad term. It could mean functions, it could mean classes, it could mean packages even. But the point is, at whatever level we're looking at, when we're defining our modules, modularity tells us we want each to be singly responsible and cohesive. We want everything within a given class to be related to each other. We want every function to do a single thing. But we want to minimize how much these depend on each other. And if two modules both depend on each other, so going back to UML diagrams, we talked about if we have two classes and this class uses this one and this class uses this one, that's coupling. That's bad. We want to somehow design our hierarchy so that one class uses the other in a one-way direction. So that's a big focus of functional independence. Whereas, and by the way, I have examples in these slides so you can take a look at them. Abstraction, again, we're designing our program to an interface, not to an implementation. And so, again, we don't want to worry about how something works. We just want to use the abstract interface and trust that it works. Real quick, pulling up by the way, that was the music, Golden Sun. So I'm going to call that resolved for now, but if there are follow-ups, certainly ask them. Can you discuss more on modularity? So modularity, the basis of modularity is the single responsibility principle. This is the core of what modularity means. The idea that a function should do one thing when possible. Now, sometimes functions are not going to be completely modular. A good example of this is the remove function. So the function, let me pull this up here. The list function that returns object called remove int I. And the reason this function isn't perfectly modular is it has two things. It has a side effect and it has a return value. Generally, and in a perfect world, we would love each of our functions to either have a side effect or have a return value. But there, especially with remove, we're generally going to have potentially both, especially when it relates to collections. So it's not inherently a bad thing when we have this, but we want to try to avoid it when it's avoidable. Because this is effectively doing two things. It is producing the side effect of the list, it is removing a value at an index, and it is returning that value, getting what was stored there. Again, in this context, it's understandable, but it slightly violates. It's a very minor violation of single responsibility principle. It's kind of like going 1 mile per hour over the speed limit. Technically, you're breaking the rules, but everyone understands that it's not really a big deal. Some traffic cop is going to get mad at me for saying that, but whatever. What we don't want is we don't want one class being responsible for completely disparate things. So I actually have a diagram here. So let's say this were a class. We have 5 methods, A, B, C, D, and E. E is a static helper method. That's why it's blue. We have 2 fields, X and Y. Now, function A calls function B, and function B uses or modifies field X. Function C uses both X and Y. Function D only uses Y, and it calls a private static function E. So to this end, this is a cohesive class. We can't really break this class up into smaller classes. As opposed to here. Here we really have, if this were all one class, we could break this up into 2 separate classes because the X and Y fields don't interact in any meaningful way. Before, when C used both these fields, yeah, this is a cohesive class. But now this is less cohesive. So we want a high degree of cohesion. High cohesion meaning everything within a class relates to one concept, relates to each other. But we want loose coupling. That is, modules depend on each other as little as possible. And certainly modules are going to have some dependency. Dependency itself isn't inherently bad. Too much dependency is bad because it makes it to where our system becomes unstable, where if we make one change, it breaks a bunch of different subsystems rather than having a clear hierarchy. So, any questions about modularity or about the other two concepts I covered? Okay. Good morning, by the way. I do see that. I'm just all right. So I'm gonna call that resolved, but again, unresolve it and ask a follow up if you feel I missed something. Could you go over UML diagrams? Let me be so I'm not gonna reteach the lecture, but what I will do is I will go over kind of the big points. I should note that you are responsible for knowing more than just the class diagram. So, for example, we have already talked about the activity diagram, we've talked about the use case diagram, the state diagram. These three diagrams you are expected to know. But obviously, the one that I'm just going to tell you, you can expect to draw a class diagram. So, first, this is how you draw a single UML class. You list the fields, you list the methods, you list the visibility, plus for public, minus for private, pound sign for protected. You list the inputs of the methods. So, for example, set quantity in stock takes in an int, etc. Forgive me 1 second. My nose is significantly bothering me. Apologies. Sorry about that. Just didn't want to blow my nose on camera. That would have been gross. Anyway, so this is how we draw a single class. That's the starting point, is draw all your classes. From there, we need to look at our relationships. And broadly, I'm interested in three different types of relationships: dependency, aggregation, and generalization. Now, you may see things like association or things like the difference between composition and aggregation in various different places. For the sake of this class, again, I'm only expecting you to correctly use these. If you figure out if you kind of get the subtle difference between association and dependency or aggregation composition, you want to do that, you're welcome to. But if you use these four, you'll be able to get 100%. So these first two relate entirely to inheritance. That is to say, you use this arrow, the dotted line, whenever you are either extending an abstract class or implementing an interface. If you are extending a non-abstract class, such as some of the examples I gave in class, if you go back and look, and this was before exam 1, but alarm clock extends clock. Clock was not abstract. Clock could be instantiated. In the case that you're extending a non-abstract class, you use the inheritance arrow, the solid line. If it's an abstract class that you're extending or you're implementing an interface, you use realization. Aggregation is actually a very specific type of dependency. Aggregation specifically implies ownership. So, for example, if I have something like, and I'll leave some space here, if I have something like public class library, and that has something like a list book books, something like that. This is ownership. Whereas, for example, if I had a function like find book by author, or find books by author, and this takes in author A. Give me 1 sec here. And then I'm going to similarly have another class, public class book, and book has some field author, author. Something like this. In this case, library aggregates books and book aggregates author. That is, a book has an author, the library has a list of books. Library uses author, but library does not have author. Even though library has books and books have author, library itself does not use, or does not own the author object. So there is a dependency in this case. Let me try to make sure this all fits on the screen. There is a library, and I'll do my best to draw this. Library uses author, but hang on, let me remember the alt code for diamond. It's going to be alt 4. Okay. However, library, and it's going to be, let's see if this works. Yes. Book. This is notepad art for you, everyone. Anyway, now I should note that this should technically be hollow, but I'm not going to look for that alt code. The point being, library aggregates book, and remember that the diamond goes on the side. The diamond is on the owner's side, so the library aggregates books. Anytime we have an aggregation relationship, we also need to specify the multiplicity. That is to say, the ratio. So for example, one library has 0 to many books. Excuse me. Oh, no worries. Sorry, just got distracted there by something. One library has 0 to many books, and each book, again, we're assuming the book is not the idea of Moby Dick, but rather like a specific copy of Moby Dick. So like a book would be this object, not the literature, but like specifically this is a book. One book belongs in one library. So from book to library, one book belongs in one library. Each book belongs in exactly one library, because this book can only be in one place. By the way, Farewell to Arms, great book if you ever get a chance to read it. Anyway, I've been reading it when I've had a chance. Whereas a library could, in theory, have 0 books. It would not be a very good library, but in theory, it could have 0 books. Or it could have as many books as we want. So this would be the multiplicity. We don't need to specify the multiplicity of dependency, because there's no ownership here. But for example, we might say, in the case of book has an author, change this, book to author. In this case, every author could have 0 or more books. Every author object could be tied to 0 or more books, because it could be that someone's an author, but they haven't actually gotten any books published. Additionally, every book could, in theory, have more than one author. There are textbooks, for example, that have many authors. So at that point, I would actually say 1 to star, because every book has at least one author, but not that. And remember that this means every author has 0 or more books, and every author appears in 0 or more books, and every book has 1 or more authors. So that's the multiplicity. Are there any follow-up questions about UML? No one's typed anything for a while, so I assume I was explaining things perfectly, and there is no confusion whatsoever. Therefore, I'm going to write the hardest possible UML question on the exam. No, I'm not. I've already written the UML question, actually. When you say in, oh, okay, sorry, that was an earlier question. I thought you were asking. Yeah. Okay. All right. And again, I'm trying to make this as approachable as possible because the reality is, generally when you'll see association is when some outside observer views those two things as connected, but that gets a bit too theoretical to really do on an exam, so I'm just not going to bother with it. And then composition, I'll just go ahead and briefly explain the difference. Composition means that the subordinate object. So it's the same as aggregation. You have an owner and an owned, and we're calling the owned object the subordinate object. It's to say the subordinate object can't exist without the parent. So, for example, a tire can exist without a car, but a symphony can't exist without the composer. But again, I'm not expecting you to know the difference. It's just worth to know it. Which style of arrow is aggregation supposed to represent? It looks dashed, but it's not. So this is just a limitation of Notepad. Um, I guess that kind of looks like a solid line, but it's just the limitation of the text. It's not supposed to be a dotted line. So with the dotted line, I'm putting extra space in between. So this, in theory, would be a solid line, again, for the sake of Notepad. Is there going to be multiplicity for all relationships? So the only relationship that has multiplicity is aggregation. Aggregation specifically has it. We would then also take one step further, and I would label this line to say that library lists books. Something like that. That it stores it in a list. And something like book written by author. I would label the relationships, again, for aggregation. I would even label it for dependency. So, for example, uses in queries. I spelled queries very, very wrong there. Hey, it only took me 3 tries. But you would label the relationships with some kind of meaningful statement. You could say uses in a function. Generally, the idea of these labels is also to kind of give a high-level explanation. So, how does library use author and functions? Well, so far the only function that it has is this, and it's being used in a query to look up books. But that said, I mean, it would be sufficient even just to say uses. I would not take points off if you just said uses. This is more of a general, like, this is a good way to help explain it. But again, the difference here is ownership versus usage. Because again, this is a dependency. I want to be very clear. This is very much a dependency. It's a special case of dependency. Is there going to be multiplicity for... Oh, sorry, I already answered that one. So again, yeah, pretend this is a solid line. Even though it's not, and that's just the limitation of Notepad. So this is the dotted line. Any other questions on UML? Any UML, not just state, but any UML, or about these relationships? I'll give a minute for people. Let me see if there are any other questions on this. The first thing I just saw this question. I assume it was a follow up. Can you explain? Sorry, I didn't mean to resolve it. Can you explain how functional independence, this and abstraction seem quite subjective? They are and they aren't, and I'll try to get to an example of. It's more of a bad functional independence when you see it. And I'll try to give some kind of example, but yeah. I'll explain which arrows the arrows point. So just quickly, the inheritance. The arrow is on the side of the class being extended. So for example, is the aggregation supposed to have an arrowhead on the diamond? No, it is not. Sorry, I shouldn't have put an arrow there. You're exactly right. Sorry, this is the limitations of ASCII art. Is it makes me do that? Yes, correct. I should not have an arrow there. But just to be clear, and I don't know how to do a triangle. So for now, just assume. Let's assume that is a full triangle pointing right, and it's just again limitations of ASCII art here. Yeah, I could do that. I could do. That's a good point. I'll do that. Good point. So from there, this would be child, and again, assume that's a solid line. Parent, implementer, interface. The difference between dashed and solid. This relates to extending a concrete class. This relates to implementing an interface or extending an abstract class. So the difference here is that with the solid line, sorry, let me, again, bad ASCII art here. I'm doing my best, I swear. So with the dotted line, what it means is that the thing on the right can't be implemented by itself. That rather it's an abstraction and the implementer is realizing it. It is making it real as opposed to abstract. Over here, the thing on the right, the parent, so the solid line in this case, the parent could exist by itself. Whereas the child extends, in this case, a concrete class. So if you go back to the clock and alarm clock class, alarm clock extends clock, but clock could be realized. Whereas I did an example with triangle where the parent class was abstract. In that case, we would use this one. Any other follow-up questions? So what if a class is both in the field and the method of another class? So in that case, it's aggregation. So an example, a very practical example of this would be something like add book B. This function, you could very much imagine this function being in a library, right? This doesn't change the fact that this is still ownership. Because of this means ownership. So anything that it's a field, the method using it is just additional dependency, but we only draw this relationship. Because remember, aggregation is a dependency, it's just a very specific kind of dependency. Last questions on UML? All right, I'm going to look at the next question, but I'll look back at chat before I move on. What sort of conventions are most important? I think I covered those. But just to be clear, with aggregation, you need to state the multiplicity, and you also need to label your relationships meaningfully. Other than that, I think I covered everything. Can we go over the software crisis? Okay, so let me skip to that one just because I've already gone over this a bit, but I'll go back to it and try to give some more concrete examples. Can we so the software crisis, understand that software crisis is not a past event. It's not something that has happened. It is a state of software development where we still, although software development has gotten substantially better since, when this term was coined in the early 70s or late 60s even. This is not something that's over. It is more a recognition of the fact that hardware has grown faster and faster and faster and faster. My desktop here, there she is. Isn't she a beaut? My desktop here um, is significantly cheaper to build than the first gaming desktop I built. And that's because the hardware has gotten so much better, so much cheaper, so much faster, etc., that me building this laptop, or excuse me, this desktop in 2020 to build a substantially more powerful machine than the first desktop I built in 2009 cost about half as much, and it's significantly more powerful. And that's because even still, hardware gets exponentially better and better. Now that's starting to trail off because we're actually starting to hit physical limitations. For example, theoretically, absolutely theoretically, you could not store bits on anything really smaller than subatomic particles. And at that point, even then, it's questionable if you can do that. But subatomic particles are as small as we could go. We're going to run into that physical barrier, actually probably a physical barrier before that, sooner rather than later. Um, Similarly, your computer cannot physically move medium faster than the speed of light from one point on the computer to another. So information from the memory to the processor could not theoretically move faster than the speed of light, etc. There are physical barriers that eventually we will run up against. But that is to say that hardware still has been exploding and still continues to explode year after year after year for decades. Software engineering has increased not even exponentially. In some cases, it's still not even better than it used to be. Although some methodologies have helped, object-oriented programming has helped. Agile development for small projects has helped, although it doesn't really help for large projects at all. The point being, their software has not grown exponentially, hardware has. And so the big bottleneck in terms of developing good software really is the software side, because we have the physical medium to run very, very powerful software on. It's just we human developers are the bottleneck. If software fails, it is most likely because of a human error rather than a hardware error. Not to say hardware errors happen, but I'm talking about a software development process, not a single computer. So the software crisis is the idea that hardware grows significantly faster than human software development ability, and as a result of that, because the hardware is better, we expect software to do bigger and more complex things, but the actual software development has not kept up with that growth, and so we're still finding limitations on how complex software can be, even though our hardware can handle it. And it's the human factor that causes that. So the software crisis is not something that happened. It is just a state. It's a state that has continued. Any questions about that? I'm out of water. Oh no, I'm not. Sorry, I had a second glass over there. All right. Can we set up tour at the end of lecture of my house? No. Of my basement, maybe, but certainly not my house. I don't want to. No offense to any of you. I don't want you to know my address. Um, and that is more just out of, because keep in mind I have 40 viewers right now. Oh, the tech setup. You mean you just want to? Yeah. I mean, here I'll do that real quick, just to because I'm still kind of mentally preparing examples. Sorry, T-Tours. Here we go. All right. Hi. So this is my desk. So that's my laptop, which is currently I'm not using. This is my desk, so you can actually see this is what my interface looks like. So I actually have OBS set up on this monitor, and this is the monitor that I'm screen sharing. That's my desktop over there. And then that camera is my whiteboard camera, and I set it on that table over there. And that in the box is a Stewart, and that over there on the couch, although he's blending in, he's hard to see, is a Colby Bear. There you go. Okay. Get this cord out of the way. All right. So, and actually, it's funny because I actually do have a lot of streaming experience. I streamed here as a Storm, so it's come in handy in teaching this class. Which it's funny what little skills you pick up end up being vital. Anyway, all right. So functional independence in a less obvious case. So again, I would say first and foremost that I don't know necessarily what you mean by less obvious. What I will say is here's examples of loose coupling. A module called tweet counter goes to a module called tweet reader and says give me all the tweets through some single function call, and it sent back a list of tweets. What would be not functionally independent is if I have, say, the tweet counter module and tweet reader were to do something like they both modify some shared variable. So I'm going to do my best to illustrate this, which is not going to go well. But if these two, I know this is like so podunk what I'm doing here, but if these two modify some shared variable, now they're coupled because now they both have to be aware of the same variable in addition to being aware of each other, because tweet counter still has to be aware of tweet reader. So the fact that tweet reader returns the information as part of the interface actually increases functional independence, as opposed to if tweet reader, say, modified this shared variable, that would involve fair enough. Okay. Anyway, if they modified some shared variable, now tweet counter has to be aware that calling a function in tweet reader changes some other variable that it's aware of, which is not functionally independent because now they both have a dependency on a shared variable and each other in that respect. To that end, are there any questions? So that would be loose coupling, as opposed to tight coupling. Um, this would be an example of tight coupling, whereas tweet counter just using tweet reader is an example of loose coupling, and we want loose coupling. We want this where tweet counter just uses the interface, not where we have to have some shared understanding of a variable, which would be tight coupling. So coupling as a term relates to functional independence, and we always want loose coupling. Some examples of tight coupling: tweet counter has to translate a coordinate from how it's stored in tweet or how it's stored in tweet to how it's stored in state. So for example, tweet counter is both aware of how tweet stores its coordinate information and how state stores it. Rather, we rely on just using a single coordinate object. So yes, tweet counter does depend on that. But this, using a single coordinate object, would be more functionally independent because then each object just simply uses that coordinate class. It simplifies the dependencies. So I would go off those examples there. And I apologize, I did get distracted there. I also unfortunately have to moderate chat at the same time as I give this lecture. All right. Any last questions here? We're at 131, so technically I have another 15 minutes. So you can just type in chat or on Piazza. Let me just refresh this to make sure I've hit all these points. Again, what I will say is that there is a certain level of subjectivity, but bad functional independence is something that when you see it, you realize it. And generally it involves something like two functions modifying the same shared variable, when such a relationship could be avoided. By the way, functional independence is generally why static global variables are bad. Not to say they're always bad, but often, especially as younger programmers, I will see people overuse global variables to maintain like information transferring between functions, and certainly you would want to avoid that when possible. I'll just sit here for like another, I don't know, 3 minutes, and if I don't see any questions in the interim, I will end. And again, I will, before the exam, I will make sure that everyone knows what it is. I will have a pinned post on Piazza, and I will do a video to explain the pinned post, just to try to make sure that no one can say they're not sure what's going on. I'm just curious. Someone said they saw my address, and it's possible. It's possible it's somewhere online. But I wasn't listed on that page, obviously, since I live in Virginia. Oh no, I gave so much away by saying I live in Virginia. Crazy how that works out. Or does it? It does have numbers, yes. Does it have a vowel? It does. Possibly even more than one. Maybe. How'd your move go? I mean, I still got some boxes, but the cats are doing well. We still don't have our trash cans, which is a bit of an inconvenience. We're having an issue where the city of Charlottesville says we're on the county system, and the county says we're on the city of Charlottesville system. And so I don't know who is doing our trash. Can we see your cats? Um, but they're sleeping. They're sleeping so peacefully. Here, I'll show Colby real quick, because he doesn't ever mind being picked up. Hey, bear. Oh. So this is Colby Bear. He's not. It's kind of hard to tell on camera. He's actually a very thin cat. He's just incredibly fluffy. So this is Colby Bear. Would it be possible to make the test on Colab formatted like a page filled with questions rather than clicking to each single question? Yes, I will try to fit everything onto one page. Um, you should bring him to the office. No, I actually can't do that because I can't even go to the office, and neither can you. How long have you had each of your cats? Stuart, I've had for 9 years. I got him in my first year of grad school. Colby, I got him after 1 year during my PhD program, so I've had him for 6. So they're my buddies. They snuggle with each other. They act like litter mates. It's adorable. Yeah, he's a fluffy cat. I will try to make the exam format on one page. What I may do though, because I will probably randomize the order of the questions. What I may do is if some questions need to be in order, I'll do those as a separate part. So then you'd have a next page for that. But I will, as much as possible, try to get everything onto one page. Um, They're both very sweet cats. Colby is normally very vocal, but right now he's sleepy, and he's giving me the stink eye because I woke him up. Here. He's giving me the stink eye. He's very perturbed at me right now. Any other questions? Now, just one last announcement. I've mentioned this on Piazza. I've tried to go out of my way to make this clear. Homework 4 will not be accepted late. I will be releasing so you can study. Because this is the only homework assignment we really have had on design. So you can study design principles. I will be releasing the solution to homework 4 on Saturday at noon. Because I am releasing the solution, I cannot accept late submissions. So submit whatever you have if you haven't finished yet before then. And that's because after the solution's out, obviously I'm not going to accept any submissions. No, Colby's trying to climb into the box with Stewart, but the box is too small even for Stewart. So, and yes, the cats are named after Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert. All right, that's all I have today. If you have any other questions, I'm just gonna mark all these as resolved, but certainly you can have. Can we discuss? Can we discuss the extent of FXML? There we go. There's a new question. Can we discuss the FXML? So I'm just gonna quickly pull up the FXML that we worked on yesterday real quick. Open recent. So here is what I would expect, and I'm not going to give you a grid pane. Basically, this is the level I would expect. I'm not going to. If I do FXML, it's going to be a flow pane. What you should realize is that this FXID is used to populate a variable name. So like this is a variable for the pane called myPane. This is a variable for the label field called myText. This is a variable name for the button field ID, and this necessarily will have a controller class, and that controller class will just have myText and myButton. Here they are, myText, myButton, and these come from myText, myButton. Similarly, the text field, I would expect you to know that, which I'm not. Don't even worry about what this is. I don't worry at all. But text also on button. But from there, I would expect you to know the on action. I would also expect you to be familiar with the basics of text field. And text field is, let me see if it even shows up in the scene builder. Yeah, this is a text field. You can type in it. You can have a preset value. Hi, Mom, something like that. But you just use the getText function to get the contents of the text area as a string. And from there, all you need to set this to a variable name is something like fxid equals my text field, and then in your controller class, you would just have at fxml text field, my text field. And the key is this name, this variable name, needs to match this exactly, including case. That's what I would expect you to know. The hint being that it might involve writing, say, a controller class from an FXML. Maybe, hypothetically, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Any other questions? We're getting close to 145, and I'm going to cut it off there. If you haven't yet, make sure that you have a group for homework 5. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to say you can't work alone again, but you can have a group of 2 or a group of 3. If you're having trouble finding a group, I would just post on Piazza, or you can email me and I'll try to do what I can to find a group. But I would prefer you post on Piazza and try to look for yourself, just to lower my workload. Remember, that's due April. What was it? I think it was Wednesday, April 8th, I believe. So it was 2 weeks from yesterday. Uh, just real quick, if you're still in chat, SWK3ST. Um, have the quizzes have been formatted that way, correct? You haven't had to hit next to go to each question. They've all been on the same page. I believe that's the case. Yes. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. Because you do have to hit next. That's been unintended. Okay. I will try to make sure that I find the setting that keeps it all on one page. That has been my intent. But apparently I have not succeeded in that. And no one had mentioned it until now, so I didn't know. Because Colab, the preview for professors, is not good. Like, I technically have a student preview, but it has been inaccurate many times. So I'll try to correct that. And I will have a quiz up today for Java FX. It's probably going to be pretty short. It's probably only going to be 5 questions, so I'll just make each worth 2 points. Um, but it's just to have a quiz for the concept we've covered. All right, well, I'll cut it off there. Best of luck prepping for the exam. Again, by Monday night, I will have a pin post on Piazza explaining the exam procedure, but you should expect having a camera will help you. You will expect to draw a UML diagram, so you'll need something to take a picture of that. But that will be within the 60-minute time limit. All right, take care, everyone.